Records preserved within the dusty halls of the Wilkinson County Courthouse reference a plantation so grotesque in its operations that local authorities later sought to erase every trace of it from public record after the Civil War. For 23 years, between 1835 and 1858, the Jessup family plantation functioned under what neighboring landowners privately referred to as the breeding operation. A program so systematic, so depraved, that it blurred the line between commerce and horror. It was a calculated enterprise where the plantation master, his wife, and each of their 5 children engaged in forced reproduction with enslaved people, not for passion or cruelty alone, but to amplify profit and secure generational wealth. What renders this case particularly chilling is not only the nature of the acts themselves, but the deliberate, almost scientific precision with which they were carried out. The family's collective participation and the silence of a community that refused to see. The Jessup ledgers, uncovered in 1962 within a locked trunk, chronicled every transaction with the icy precision of cattle records, though these entries described human lives. Before we delve further into the nightmare of the Jessup plantation, into the minds of a family who convinced themselves that breeding human beings like livestock was sound business, I ask you to subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And please share in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's return to Mississippi in 1835, to the beginning of this darkness. Wilkinson County, Mississippi, in 1835 was cotton territory, where fortunes rose and perished with every harvest. The Jessup plantation sprawled across 1,200 acres of fertile delta soil, about 8 miles northeast of Woodville, the county seat. Isaiah Jessup acquired the Keys property in 1829 with inheritance money from his father, a Virginia tobacco merchant who had amassed considerable profits supplying Confederate forces during earlier conflicts. Isaiah was 31 at the time, newly married to Ruth Cavendish, daughter of a South Carolina planter. Ruth was 23, educated in Charleston, and came from a lineage that had cultivated rice for 3 generations. The Jessup estate primarily produced cotton, but also sustained vegetable gardens, an orchard, and livestock. By 1835, Isaiah owned 42 enslaved people, not the largest number in the region, but sufficient to mark him as a man of wealth. The mansion itself was a 2-story Greek revival structure, adorned with white columns, featuring 6 bedrooms above, a grand dining hall, Isaiah's study, and a parlor where Ruth hosted the wives of neighboring landowners. Married in 1830, Isaiah and Ruth welcomed their first child, Thomas, in 1831, then Samuel in 1833, Margaret in 1835, Daniel in 1837, and Elizabeth in 1839, 5 children in 8 years. Ruth managed the domestic sphere with the help of enslaved servants, while Isaiah oversaw the fields, traveled frequently to Natchez for trade, and cultivated relationships with brokers and fellow planters. To outsiders, the Jessups appeared the picture of Southern prosperity, a respectable, church-going family of the antebellum elite. They attended services each Sunday at the Woodville Presbyterian Church. Isaiah served on the county's agricultural board. Ruth joined various charitable societies. Their children were tutored privately by Charles Whitfield, an educator from Kentucky who lived in a small cottage on the estate, teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, and scripture. Yet behind the pristine facade of the plantation house, Isaiah and Ruth engaged in conversations that would have shocked even their most hardened, slave-owning peons. So Isaiah had grown fixated on a problem tormenting many planters, the rising cost of acquiring enslaved laborers. Throughout the 1830s, prices climbed steadily. A healthy adult field hand cost between £800 and $200, a staggering expense. When enslaved workers aged, fell ill, or died, that money vanished. Isaiah spent long nights hunched over his account books, recalculating expenses, predicting losses. Ruth, having observed plantation economics from her father's estate, understood slavery's arithmetic as clearly as any man. Her father had always said that the most prosperous plantations were those that bred their own, ensuring a self-replenishing labor force, a philosophy that, in the Jessup household, would soon take on a horrifying new meaning. to create new laborers without the financial burden of constant purchase. This was a routine practice across the South, yet the Cavendish estate had carried it to darker extremes. Ruth's father had long orchestrated the pairing of enslaved individuals he deemed strong or fertile, often tearing families apart to produce what he called superior breeding pairs. Ruth absorbed these principles from childhood and carried them into her marriage, but Isaiah's ambitions reached beyond her father's precedent. In the cold winter months of 1834, while Ruth was expecting Margaret, Isaiah proposed an idea that would shape not only the next 2 decades of their marriage, but also the fate of every soul bound to their land. He suggested that instead of merely encouraging reproduction among the enslaved, they should take part in it themselves. His justification, delivered with the calm logic of business, was purely economic. Any child born of these forced unions would by law inherit the mother's enslaved status, but would carry Jessup blood, a lineage Isaiah believed would yield stronger, healthier, and more profitable offspring. These children could either sustain the plantation's labor force or be sold at a premium. In his words, it was an investment in our future prosperity. Ruth did not reject him outright. She pondered the proposition in silence for weeks. She prayed over it. She examined the ledgers. She remembered her father's practices, and ultimately she consented, though with a single stipulation. Their own children, she decreed, would be raised to see this as duty, their sacred contribution to the family's continued wealth. When the time came, every one of them would take part. The household would function as a unified enterprise, maximizing output and securing success for generations to come. This was not born from lust or cruelty, though its fruits would be monstrous. It was deliberate, structured economics, clothed in the language of family obligation. Once Ruth agreed, the indoctrination began. Thomas Jessup was merely 3 years old when his education commenced. He could not yet comprehend the horror beneath his lessons, but the conditioning began early. Isaiah and Ruth spoke freely at the dinner table, referring to the enslaved as assets, as capital, as breeding stock. Their tone never shifted from the same pragmatic detachment they used when discussing livestock. From his earliest memories, Thomas absorbed that language, and with it, the normalization of inhumanity. By the time he reached 8 years of age in 1839, he already understood the role he was destined to fulfill. His father explained it during their daily walks across the property. Thomas's task was to expand the labor force, to ensure the family's future. Isaiah framed it as honor, as maturity, as the natural responsibility of a son born into privilege. Samuel received the same indoctrination, and later so did Daniel. The girls, Margaret and Elizabeth, were trained differently but toward the same purpose. Ruth taught them that a woman's highest calling was motherhood, and that bearing children who enriched the family's estate was the purest expression of devotion. She drilled into them the belief that enslaved women existed beneath them in every conceivable way, and that using them for profit was no different from using them to cook or clean. They were instruments of wealth, resources to be managed. The Jessup children grew up in isolation, their world confined within the plantation boundaries. They had almost no companionship beyond one another. Their tutor, Charles Whitfield, a quiet man from Kentucky, taught them arithmetic and scripture. Yet the true lessons, the ones that would shape their morality, came from their parents. By 1845, Thomas was 14, Samuel 12, and their destinies had already been sealed. Margaret was 10, Daniel was 8, and Elizabeth was 6. The household functioned with military precision, every hour accounted for, every task performed according to schedule. Meals were served at the same time each day, church was mandatory on Sundays, and the week revolved around work and discipline. Isaiah increasingly drew Thomas into the daily management of the plantation, instructing him on how to inspect the cotton fields, assess the health and output of enslaved laborers, and measure every decision by its profit or loss. The Jessup children never questioned what they were taught because they had no alternative reality to compare it to. There were no outside influences, no dissenting voices. Their tutor, obedient and cautious, never challenged Isaiah's rule. The visiting Presbyterian minister observed only a thriving, God-fearing estate, and other plantation families who dined with the Jessops noticed nothing out of place, or if they did, they remained silent. In the antebellum South, privacy was sacred. What happened on a man's property was his concern alone. The treatment of enslaved people was a matter left unspoken. On a humid May evening in 1848, as Thomas reached his 17th birthday, Isaiah summoned him into the study after supper. Ruth sat quietly in the corner chair while Thomas took his seat across from his father's desk. Isaiah spoke to him in the tone of a man conducting business rather than addressing his son. He told Thomas that he was now grown, that the time had come to perform his duty to the family. A young woman named Hannah, 20 years of age and employed in the kitchen, had been chosen. She would be brought to Thomas's quarters that night. Thomas did not protest. He had been groomed for this moment from childhood. It was his responsibility, his obligation. That night marked the grim beginning of the Jessup Plantation's breeding program, one that would come to define its legacy for the next decade. Within 3 months, Hannah conceived. She gave birth to a boy in May of 1849. Isaiah entered the record with methodical pride. He named the infant Isaac, wrote property of Jessup Plantation beside the notation, and calculated the child's estimated market value upon reaching adulthood. 2 weeks after giving birth, Hannah returned to her work in the kitchen, while the newborn was cared for by an elderly enslaved woman named Claudia, who had tended countless children born into bondage. Thomas resumed his duties without hesitation. Over the following 3 years, he fathered 4 additional children with 3 different enslaved women. In 1850, when Samuel turned 17, he too was initiated into the same role. Daniel followed in 1854. The daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth, were not exempt. Their involvement would come in another form. Isaiah personally selected enslaved men he deemed to possess ideal physical traits: strength, endurance, straight posture, good teeth, and clear eyes, to pair with his daughters. Margaret turned 18 in 1853, and Ruth spent months preparing her for what was to come. Margaret did not resist. She had been conditioned all her life to believe this was ordinary, even virtuous, a sacred duty to the family's prosperity. In November of that year, an enslaved blacksmith named Jacob, 25 years old, was brought to her room. Margaret conceived soon after and gave birth to a daughter in August of 1854. Ruth insisted that Margaret continue her role, and over the next 4 years, she bore 3 more children. Elizabeth followed the same path when she turned 18 in 1857. By then, the system was complete, precise, relentless, and emotionless. The Jessup family operated like a machine, each member performing their assigned role. Isaiah maintained meticulous records of every birth, every name, every calculated profit, as though humanity itself had become a column in his ledger. Isaiah kept meticulous records. Ruth oversaw the household, managed supplies, and supervised every pregnancy and birth. The sons fulfilled their appointed tasks. The daughters produced children. The enslaved people had no choice, no voice, no escape. What made the Jessup enterprise especially horrific was not only the forced reproduction itself, but the organized precision with which it was executed. Isaiah approached it as if it were crop management. He rotated the enslaved women assigned to his sons to prevent what he termed the overuse of any one individual. He charted menstrual cycles. He increased food rations for the pregnant, not out of mercy, but to guarantee stronger infants. He separated mothers from their children at the age of 3, insisting that early division prevented attachments that could hinder productivity. The plantation ledgers from this period, later unearthed and preserved, remain terrifying in their detail. Each entry lists the mother's name, the date of birth, the child's gender, any distinguishing physical traits, and an estimated market value. The children fathered by Isaiah himself, he began participating in 1850, once Thomas had demonstrated the efficiency of the method, were marked with a small notation in the margin. J. Direct line. These were, in Isaiah's belief, the most valuable of all due, destined either to yield high prices or to become the strongest laborers if retained. By 1855, the plantation's enslaved population had risen from 42 to 68, 26 of them children under 10, all born through the breeding program. The Jessup family's fortune expanded rapidly. Isaiah purchased an adjoining 300 acres, constructed a new barn, a cotton gin house, and additional quarters to hold the swelling population. Among planters of Wilkinson County, he was now considered a model of success. Life on the Jessup plantation moved to a cruel rhythm. Field laborers rose before dawn, toiled until darkness, and returned to their cabins drained of strength. House servants endured slightly shorter days, but were under constant scrutiny. Children born into bondage were set to tasks almost as soon as they could walk, carrying water, picking vegetables, running small errands. By 10, they were working the fields or apprenticed to trades. The population grew, yet true families could not. Isaiah's decree of early separation ensured that mothers and children shared only their first 3 years together, and even then most of the mothers worked from sunrise to nightfall. The elderly woman, Claudia, who tended to the infants, tried to offer some semblance of affection, though she often had a dozen little ones in her care at once. The psychological toll on the enslaved was immeasurable, though no such anguish appeared in Isaiah's ledgers. They lived beneath a constant shadow of fear, aware that any woman could be chosen, any child could be taken, and that refusal meant torture or death. Some dared to defy it. In 1851, a woman named Sarah fled after being forced to bear her third child by Samuel Jessup. She made it 17 miles before slave patrols captured her. She was brought back to the plantation, flogged in front of the others, and confined to a narrow storage shed for 2 weeks with barely enough food or water to survive. When released, she never spoke again. She worked in silence until pneumonia claimed her in 1863, her body buried without a marker in the plantation's cemetery. The Jessup offspring, Thomas, Samuel, Margaret, Daniel, and Elizabeth, all participated in the machinery their parents created, though each carried it differently. Thomas, the eldest, accepted his obligations without visible doubt. He managed plantation operations, supervised laborers, traveled for trade, and continued fathering children with enslaved women as required. In 1853 he married Virginia Gentry, the daughter of a neighboring planter. Yet marriage did nothing to alter his role in the family system. The breeding continued, as methodical and cold as ever. Virginia either remained unaware of the full horror unfolding on the Jessup plantation or deliberately turned away from it, choosing silence over confrontation. Samuel, the second son, began showing visible cracks as early as 1852. He drank heavily, vanishing for days into nearby towns or woods, only to return disheveled and hollow-eyed. Isaiah punished him harshly for dereliction of duty, but Samuel's dependence deepened. By 1855, he could function, but barely. His eyes dulled, his words few, his presence a shadow among both family and enslaved alike. He never took a wife. His involvement in the breeding system continued until 1858, though his behavior grew increasingly unstable, oscillating between numb compliance and bursts of quiet despair. Margaret, after bearing her fourth child in 1857, fell into what Ruth described in letters to her sister as spells of melancholy. She locked herself in her room for days, refusing food, avoiding speech, her silence mistaken for defiance. Ruth regarded it not as suffering, but as weakness, a condition to be corrected, not comforted. Margaret was not excused from her role. She bore a fifth child in 1859, mere months before the collapse of the entire operation. Daniel and Elizabeth, the youngest, had been raised so deeply within this machinery that they accepted its logic as truth. When their turn came, they obeyed without visible hesitation. This unquestioning obedience was perhaps the darkest tragedy of all, a testament to how thoroughly cruelty could be normalized, how evil could masquerade as order when inherited through generations. Yet by 1856, fractures began to appear. The enslaved population had swelled beyond capacity, quarters overflowed, food supplies, once sufficient, now strained. More dangerously, the mixed-race children, the offspring of the Jessup men, were growing old enough to notice. By age 8 or 9, some began to ask why their skin was lighter, their hair finer, their features different. Older slaves whispered truths in secret after dark, huddled in the flicker of firelight. Anger took root. Fear curdled into resentment. Even Isaiah's rigid control could not suppress the tension. The enslaved knew whose blood ran in which child. They recognized the faces of their masters in the eyes of the children they tended. They hated the system, yet any whisper of resistance risked torture or being sold further south, into places even more brutal. Whispers spread among neighboring plantations. People noticed the unusual growth of the Jessup estate, the imbalance of children to adults, the strange timing of Ruth's daughters' pregnancies before their marriages. But this was the antebellum South, where white silence protected white sin. No one confronted Isaiah. As long as the Jessups maintained public decorum, the veil held. Isaiah himself showed no remorse. Surviving letters reveal a man utterly devoid of moral hesitation, writing coolly about cotton yields, politics, and breeding results, as though cataloguing livestock. His pride was economic, not human. He compared his success in increasing numbers of healthy births to improving cattle stock, measuring profit where there should have been shame. In his mind, he had achieved mastery, not only over land and bodies, but over conscience itself. He saw no slaves, only assets, no lives, only returns. To him, it was not cruelty, it was stewardship, legacy, wealth made flesh. Ruth's outlook, revealed in the rare letters she sent to her sister in South Carolina, mirrored that same chilling detachment. Her worries revolved around her children's well-being and their futures, but her concern remained strictly practical. Whether Thomas would prove capable of managing and inheriting the plantation, whether Samuel's heavy drinking would evolve into a serious disgrace, whether the daughters would secure proper marriages. Despite the ongoing horror of the breeding program she supervised, Ruth never once expressed sympathy for the enslaved women forced into rape, or for the children born into servitude, or for the slow corrosion of every soul trapped within that system. In her eyes, the enslaved were mere property, instruments for labor, their agony irrelevant, their humanity unseen. The moral blindness that consumed the Jessup family was far from unique. It was a sickness that infected thousands of plantation households across the South. What distinguished the Jessups was the structure, the deliberate order, the family-wide participation, their cold, methodical pursuit of generational profit. Most breeding on plantations occurred through individual acts of exploitation. Isaiah's program, however, was organized, a planned enterprise built upon calculated cruelty. The year 1858 marked the beginning of the slow collapse of that carefully constructed empire. In February, Charles Whitfield, the tutor who had lived with the Jessups for over 20 years, died suddenly of heart failure at the age of 57. His death silenced a man whose quiet compliance had kept the machine turning. Whitfield had seen everything: the women forced into submission, the children whose features betrayed their lineage, the expansion of the population that spoke of his den atrocities. Yet he had remained silent, complicit through inaction, his morality consumed by convenience. With his death, Isaiah declared that no more tutors were needed. Elizabeth, now 19, was deemed sufficiently educated. Daniel, 21, already managed the plantation's operations. There would be no outsiders, no witnesses, only the Jessups and those they owned. The isolation deepened. In April, an enslaved woman named Rose, aged 32 and mother to 5 children through the breeding program, fell gravely ill, likely with tuberculosis, though no one named it as such. Her body weakened, her breath shallow, her cough stained with blood. Ruth, fearing contagion, ordered her confined to a small cabin on the far edge of the quarters. There, Rose died 3 weeks later, alone, separated from her children, buried hastily in an unmarked grave. Her death echoed like a wound through the enslaved community. Rose had been a quiet strength among them, singing hymns in the twilight, offering comfort to women in despair. Her nameless burial signaled once again how utterly worthless their lives were in the eyes of the Jessups. That summer brought further decay. The cotton crop was devastated by boll weevils, slashing Isaiah's profits and pushing him toward desperate measures. To recover losses, he decided to sell several of the enslaved children, boys and girls between 8 and 12 years old, to a trader bound for Louisiana. 4 of them were his son's children. At dawn one August morning, the children were taken from their mothers, loaded into a wagon without farewells, their cries swallowed by the sound of wheels on dust. The mothers' arms were held back, their grief silenced. In that moment, something irreparable broke within the enslaved community. A quiet acceptance that had endured for years began to crumble under the weight of unbearable loss. Had defined the previous decade began to harden into a quiet, dangerous rage. The enslaved people started whispering among themselves about running away, about the faint hope carried in stories of the Underground Railroad, about the growing rift between the North and South that seemed to shake the world beyond their fields. Some of the younger men spoke of fighting back, of rebellion and fire, but the elders warned them to be cautious. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, its fierce uprising and merciless suppression, still haunted every plantation, passed down like a warning etched in blood. Open revolt, they knew, meant death. By September, Samuel Jessup's drinking had reached its breaking point. He was discovered collapsed and unconscious in the barn, the empty bottle of whiskey beside him like a testament to his despair. Isaiah ordered him dragged back to the house, berated him with cold fury when he woke, and threatened to disinherit him if he did not change. Samuel swore he would, but his promises dissolved in liquor by nightfall. His drinking deepened, his duties vanished, and Thomas was forced to take his brother's place in managing the plantation. Margaret's mind, too, began to fracture. In October, after giving birth to her fifth child, a boy torn from her arms after only 3 days and handed to Claudia to raise, Margaret tried to end her own life. The manner was never written down, but Ruth's letter to her sister spoke of a dangerous act prevented and strict supervision required. Margaret was locked in her room for 3 weeks under Ruth's relentless watch. When she finally emerged, she was a shadow, pale, thin, hollow-eyed, speaking only when spoken to, drifting through the house like a restless spirit. The cracks in the Jessup family's facade were widening, yet they refused to see the truth bleeding through. Isaiah dismissed Samuel's ruin as weakened, mess of will. Ruth labeled Margaret's collapse as feminine hysteria. Neither of them dared trace the poison back to its source, the monstrous system they had created and sustained. Their belief that enslaved people were property, tools to be used and discarded, remained untouched, sacred, unchallenged. That November, a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend William Foster stopped at the plantation for a single night. He was from Pennsylvania, moving through the Deep South to observe and report to his northern congregation. He dined with the Jessup family, bowed his head for grace, exchanged polite conversation, but his eyes missed nothing. He noticed the unusually large number of children in the slave quarters. He saw the startling resemblance some of those children bore to the Jessups. He saw the hollow stare in Margaret's eyes, the drunken haze in Samuel's. Reverend Foster did not speak of what he suspected. Confronting them would have been both futile and dangerous. But after leaving the next morning, he recorded his thoughts in his journal, a record that would survive the years. In those pages, he wrote of his horror at what he believed was happening on the Jessup plantation and his helplessness to stop it. What power did he have? He was a northerner, a visitor with no voice in Mississippi. Slavery was lawful. Even if he had reported what he saw, no authority would have cared, as long as a master did not kill outright, and even that crime was rarely punished. He was beyond the reach of justice. Years later, Reverend Foster's notes would be published in a collection of testimonies on slavery, standing as one of the few surviving confirmations of the horrors within the Jessup estate. He wrote that the atmosphere there was a darkness beyond the ordinary darkness of bondage, and that the enslaved people seemed to live in a terror deeper than the fear of the whip. December came cold and brittle. The harvest ended, the cotton yields cut nearly in half, and with it came the first signs of pressure, financial strain closing in on Isaiah Jessup's empire of cruelty. Isaiah spent endless hours secluded in his study, poring over ledgers, reviewing accounts, calculating in cold precision how the family might maintain its profit margins. His answer was not reform, but escalation. He resolved to intensify the breeding program still further. Orders were issued to Thomas and Daniel to deepen their participation. 3 more enslaved women, chosen by Isaiah for what he deemed suitability, were selected. Targets were set, not of crops but of bodies, a precise number of births he demanded for the coming year. On Christmas Day, the Jessup family, as ritual commanded, went to church in Woodville. They occupied their customary pew, sang the hymns, bowed at the prayers, listened to the sermon. Reverend Donald Patterson preached on duty, family, and Christian virtue. The Jessups nodded, serene in agreement. After the service, they mingled on the church lawn with other planters. Ruth traded recipes and tips on household management with the other wives. Isaiah debated politics with the men. Their children stood stiffly, perfectly dressed, perfectly behaved. To every eye they seemed a model household. Yet, that afternoon, back at the plantation, Isaiah gathered them all in the parlor. He unveiled his plan to enlarge the breeding program for the new year. He laid out his expectations for each member of the family. He stressed productivity, maximized returns, the preservation of the plantation's prosperity. His voice was cool, managerial, as if he spoke of crop rotation or the upkeep of tools. The children listened. Even Samuel, dulled by drink, nodded assent. This was their normal. This was the air they had breathed since birth. But beneath it, something was moving. In the quarters, the enslaved had begun their own quiet organizing. Josiah, a 26-year-old man born on the plantation itself, was reaching outward during Sunday church gatherings where plantation slaves were sometimes allowed to attend. He gathered intelligence, escape routes, sympathetic whites, tensions between North and South that might open a door. He passed the information only to those he trusted absolutely, knowing one informant could doom them all. The stage for confrontation was being built plank by plank. The Jessups believed their dominion complete, their machinery flawless, their future unshakable. The enslaved knew otherwise. They sensed change looming, whether through flight or through the political storms already gathering. The question was never if the system would break, but when, and how much blood its breaking would demand. The year 1859 cracked open Isaiah Jessup's careful edifice. Collapse did not come from outside, but from within, from the people they had presumed to own. Desperation and fury, building over more than a decade, reached ignition. On a February night with only a sliver of moon to light the ground, 3 women, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia, made their attempt. Hannah had been Thomas's first pairing 11 years before, had borne 5 children torn from her. Rachel had been Samuel's first mother of 4. Julia had carried 3 children fathered by Daniel. All were in their late 20s or early 30s. All had crossed the threshold where death seemed less terrible than another day on the Jessup plantation. They departed separately to avoid suspicion, intending to meet 2 miles north at a creek crossing scouted on earlier Sunday walks to the neighboring plantation's church. The plan: follow the creek north, move only at night, press toward Tennessee, and then beyond. Josiah had equipped them. With the scant fragments of knowledge Josiah had managed to collect about escape paths and secret allies, they began their flight. They covered 6 long miles before dawn revealed their absence at roll call. Isaiah's rage ignited instantly. He dispatched Thomas and Daniel, accompanied by 2 enslaved trackers and a pair of hounds, to bring the women back. The dogs caught the scent with ease. By early afternoon, Hannah, Rachel, and Julia were discovered crouched in a shallow ravine, exhausted, trembling, and weaponless. They were dragged back to the plantation in heavy chains, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. Isaiah demanded a public punishment. Every enslaved man, woman, and child was ordered to gather in the yard between the main house and the quarters. The 3 women were tied to posts. The whips cracked, 10 lashes each. Their screams echoed across the fields like shattered glass. Ruth watched from the porch, silent, unmoving. The children watched from behind the windows, eyes wide, unable to look away. When it was done, Isaiah stepped forward. His voice was cold and deliberate. He called the women ungrateful, accused them of rejecting his so-called mercy, of stealing not objects but themselves, his property. He declared that their escape was theft, their rebellion sin. He warned that the next attempt would bring death. He reminded the crowd that they were fortunate to belong to the Jessup plantation, where conditions were kind. The air stood still, no one moved. No one spoke. Faces were blank, but hatred burned behind every still gaze. Hannah, Rachel, and Julia were thrown into a locked storage room for 3 days with only scraps of bread and water. When released, they returned to the fields. Hannah's wounds festered, each step agony. Rachel burned with fever for a week. Julia lived, but her spirit did not. Her eyes emptied, her voice dimmed to noth. Ing. From his upstairs window, Samuel Jessup had watched the entire punishment through a haze of whiskey. What he saw tore open the guilt he drowned daily. Those women, forced into degradation by his father's commands, were now being tortured for daring to flee. That night, staggering but furious, Samuel stormed into Isaiah's study. Their shouting rattled the house. Samuel accused his father of evil, of building a kingdom on blood and despair, of destroying his own sons in the process. Isaiah's reply was pure venom. He called Samuel weak, ungrateful, a failure. He told him he would either obey or be cast out. Samuel shouted that he'd rather be banished than be complicit one day longer. Isaiah struck him, sending him sprawling to the floor. Standing over him, Isaiah gave his final ultimatum: serve or leave with nothing. Samuel rose, face bloodied, and chose exile. He left that night, taking a horse and riding alone toward Natchez beneath a black sky. He never returned. The news of his departure rippled through the household like a quiet storm. Ruth wept, not from sorrow, but humiliation. Thomas threw himself deeper into work. Margaret withdrew completely into silence. Daniel and Elizabeth carried on, unshaken, as though nothing had changed. Isaiah forbade his son's name ever to be spoken again. Yet within the walls of that house, something had broken. Samuel's defiance had exposed the truth none dared voice aloud, that the system which enslaved others had begun devouring its own creators. The cruelty that ruled the fields was now consuming the family that had birthed it. Spring ushered in yet another wave of turmoil. Within the cramped slave quarters, a sudden outbreak of measles swept through, striking the youngest and weakest first. Several enslaved children fell ill. 2 did not survive. Among the dead was a 4-year-old girl named Clara, fathered by Thomas himself. It was the first time a child of direct Jessup blood had died on the plantation, and its impact was quietly seismic. Isaiah recorded her passing in his ledger with chilling detachment. A mere financial loss, another entry among crops and cattle. Thomas, however, though silent, stood apart at the edge of the small cemetery as her tiny coffin was lowered into the earth, his expression unreadable. In April, Margaret became pregnant again, her 6th time, and her mind was fraying beyond repair. Ruth began to fear she might not survive the coming birth. Margaret had become a shadow, barely eating, staring endlessly out the window, recoiling from any human touch. Ruth tried every tonic, every whispered remedy, but nothing pierced the fog of despair that consumed her daughter. She was imprisoned within a nightmare of her family's own making, one without escape or mercy. In May, Josiah and 4 other enslaved men made their desperate bid for freedom. Unlike the women before them, they planned carefully, hoarding scraps of food, crude tools, and a stolen knife over months. They left under the cover of darkness one Saturday night, while the White family slept. By dawn Sunday, they were gone, nearly 20 miles north, before their absence was discovered. Isaiah responded swiftly, sending Thomas and Daniel with armed riders and hounds. The hunt dragged for 3 days. Josiah's group had split, scattering through the woods, forcing the pursuers to track them one by one. Eventually, all 5 were caught and dragged back, their bodies bruised and bloodied. The punishment was merciless. Each man received 20 lashes. Josiah, deemed the ringleader, endured 30. Then Isaiah crossed a new line. He sold them all immediately to a slave trader bound for Louisiana's brutal sugar plantations, where death often came quicker than freedom. It was his warning to others. Rebellion would bring not just pain, but obliteration. The sale broke the remaining enslaved community. Josiah had been a beacon, a voice of quiet resistance, and his removal left only despair. Hope itself seemed to die that week. On the Jessup plantation, there was no mercy, no recognition of humanity, no end to the cruelty that sustained their wealth. By late July, Margaret went into labor. The ordeal lasted through the night. Ruth and an enslaved midwife named Boulaher tended to her, but the pain was unbearable. Margaret screamed until her voice gave out. When the child, a boy, finally emerged, she held him for less than a minute before collapsing into unconsciousness. 2 hours later, she was gone. Blood loss, exhaustion, her body simply gave up. For the first time, the Jessup family felt the weight of tragedy touch their own blood. Ruth collapsed in grief, inconsolable. Thomas and Daniel stood wordless, hollow. Elizabeth locked herself away. Isaiah withdrew to his study, the house echoing with silence. 3 days later, they buried Margaret in the family cemetery, her grave marked with a polished stone, a privilege denied to so many whose bones already slept beneath the same soil. The Presbyterian minister delivered a solemn eulogy, speaking of God's mysterious will and the quiet comfort found in faith. Families from neighboring plantations attended, their faces somber, their words polite condolences wrapped in silence. No one dared mention the truth, the cause of Margaret's pregnancy, the system that had taken her life. Yet just when it seemed the horror in Wilkinson County had reached its limit, it deepened once more. If this story chills you to the bone, share it with someone who craves the dark corners of forgotten history. Tap the like button to keep this work alive, and subscribe so you never miss what unfolds next. The child Margaret died bringing into the world survived. Isaiah named him Matthew and sent him to the quarters to be raised by Claudia among the other children born from the Jessup breeding program. His existence lingered as a living reminder of Margaret's death, a shadow the family refused to face. After the funeral, something shifted in Ruth. Once the enforcer of her husband's rules, the overseer of births and punishments, she had carried out her role without hesitation or guilt. But the death of her daughter tore open the walls she had built within herself. Quietly, she began to wonder if the price had been too great. If perhaps, as she whispered to Elizabeth, God himself was punishing them. Isaiah never heard these doubts. To him, such thoughts were weakness. Elizabeth, barely 20, was the most indoctrinated of all the Jessup children. She had never breathed air beyond her family's domain. Margaret's death saddened her, but she saw it as the common peril of womanhood, not the curse of her family's deeds. Without pause, she continued her participation, becoming pregnant again in September of 1859. Thomas, now 28 and managing the plantation as Isaiah aged and withdrew, began to sense that the system could know, would hold, not from conscience, he had none left, but from logic. The enslaved population grew restless, angry, field yields dropped, the fear was thick, the resentment heavier than the Mississippi air. The numbers no longer worked. The machine was eating itself, but Thomas could not imagine what could replace it. Then came the news from beyond their borders, an event that would mark the beginning of the end. In October 1859, John Brown led a raid on the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, an attempt to ignite rebellion. The plan failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But his fire reached every plantation across the South. Panic spread. Owners fortified their estates, doubled patrols, and saw rebellion in every glance. Isaiah reacted like the others, by tightening control. No enslaved person was permitted to leave the property. Even the Sunday church visits were banned. Curfew came earlier. 2 more white overseers were hired, armed with rifles and whips, their eyes sharp and cruel. The Jessup plantation became what it had always been, a prison. But now the walls were visible, the guards unhidden. Life grew unbearable. The enslaved people could no longer gather freely. Even small conversations drew suspicion. Their cabins were searched at random, their meager possessions upturned, their hidden scraps of hope exposed and destroyed. Escape attempts, acts of defiance, anything that hinted at independent thought or secret planning, all were met with growing brutality. Punishments for even the smallest infractions became harsher. A man named Robert was brutally whipped for speaking back to an overseer. A woman named Dinina was locked inside the storage shed for 2 days simply for arriving late to fieldwork. The pressure was reaching its breaking point, an unseen storm ready to erupt. And in December of 1859, it did. On the night of December 18th, a Sunday, as the white family slept and the overseers patrolled the far edges of the property, fire burst out in the cotton gin. Flames climbed fast, devouring everything in their path, fed by dry timber and the packed bales of cotton. By the time the first shouts rose, the entire structure was ablaze. The alarm spread like panic. Everyone, the white family, overseers and enslaved people, rushed to battle the inferno, forming frantic bucket lines from the well, desperate to stop the fire from leaping to other buildings. The main house and barn were saved, but the cotton gin was reduced to ashes, along with a massive store of unprocessed cotton. The financial blow was severe, but the real shock came with dawn. As Isaiah examined the smoldering ruins, he found clear proof that the fire was no accident. Oil-soaked rags had been deliberately placed to inflict maximum destruction. Rage overtook him. He ordered an immediate investigation, assembled every enslaved person, and demanded a confession. Silence. His threats filled the air like thunder. Still silence. The overseers tore through quarters, searching for evidence, any trace of guilt. Nothing. Boiling with fury, Isaiah chose 3 men at random, Peter, Moses, and James, and had them whipped savagely before everyone, 20 lashes each, to serve as an example. He declared that until someone confess, punishments would continue without end, that he would break them all if he had to. Yet no one spoke, because they all shared the guilt. The fire had been planned by 7 of them, chosen for their loyalty and resolve. Weeks of secret plotting had led to that night. The fire wasn't meant to kill. It was set when the building stood empty, but to wound Isaiah's wealth, to remind him that his captives still had power. It was a line crossed, a declaration. The enslaved had moved from endurance and quiet rebellion to open sabotage. They had discovered they could strike back even if freedom remained distant. In the months that followed, the resistance spread. Tools vanished. Fences meant to hold livestock were cut, releasing pigs into the fields. Seed corn was spoiled with dirt. Each act small but deliberate. A message written in defiance. Isaiah responded with terror, tightening his grip with cruelty that only deepened hatred. The plantation had become a silent battlefield, invisible to the outside world. To neighboring planters, the Jessup estate looked prosperous, its order intact. They saw the burned gin, but fires were common. They didn't see the smoldering war beneath. Thomas urged his father to ease the punishments, not from mercy, but calculation. The beatings were destroying labor and fueling revolt. But Isaiah refused. 24 years he had built this empire of control and breeding, and he would not surrender it now. Control would be maintained. His will would prevail. Ruth, meanwhile, had withdrawn almost completely from the management of the plantation. Margaret's death had shattered something within her that would never mend. She spent her days confined to her room, reading scripture, praying, and writing long letters to her sister in South Carolina. Letters that revealed a mind slowly unraveling beneath the unbearable weight of guilt she could no longer contain. In one such letter from January 1860, she confessed, "I fear we have sinned grievously, and God's judgment draws near. My daughter is gone. My son is lost to drink and exile, and I wake each night hearing screams, whether real or echoes of the years gone by, I cannot tell." Elizabeth gave birth to her second child in February 1860, a girl, as Margaret had been before her. Almost immediately, she was expected to return to her role in the breeding program. Unlike Margaret, Elizabeth displayed no trace of inner torment. She had been too young when it began, too deeply shaped by her parents' twisted world to develop the moral conflict that had destroyed her sister and brother. In many ways, Elizabeth stood as the program's greatest success and its most monstrous creation, a soul so thoroughly indoctrinated that she felt no remorse in perpetuating the horror of systemic rape and enslavement. As winter melted into the spring of 1860, political tensions between North and South reached their breaking point. Abraham Lincoln's campaign, with its platform opposing the spread of slavery into new territories, was viewed across the South as an existential threat. Plantation owners throughout Mississippi began whispering of secession, bracing for the storm. Isaiah attended fiery meetings in Woodville where men of wealth and pride debated how to answer what they called northern aggression. He threw himself into defending slavery in principle, speaking of Southern honor, property rights, and biblical sanction, all while remaining blind to the abominations thriving under his own roof. He could deliver eloquent speeches about divine order, about the economic necessity of bondage, about the supposed joy of the enslaved under benevolent masters, even as he compelled his own sons to rape enslaved women and tear infants from their mothers' arms. The contradiction ever seemed to pierce his conscience. In November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. South Carolina seceded the following month, and Mississippi followed soon after in January 1861. By February, 7 southern states had joined to form the Confederate States of America. War was on the horizon, though few in those early months believed it would drag on or draw much blood. The confidence across Mississippi was almost delusional that the North would relent, that Southern valor would ensure swift victory, that the world itself would never risk losing the cotton trade. Through all this, the Jessup plantation persisted. Yet beneath the calm surface, uncertainty churned. Thomas and Daniel were of fighting age and would soon be called to serve. Labor might dwindle if enslaved men were conscripted to build fortifications or forced into Confederate work crews. The breeding program, once the family's dark obsession for more than 20 years, suddenly seemed secondary to simple survival. In April 1861, Confederate guns roared at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. Within weeks, Thomas enlisted in a Mississippi regiment. Daniel followed in May. Isaiah, now 53, was too old to fight. He remained behind with Ruth, Elizabeth, the overseers, and 73 enslaved souls, many of them children fathered by the Jessup men themselves. With his sons gone, the day-to-day burden of the plantation fell upon Isaiah and the overseers. The breeding program continued, but without its former vigor or structure. Isaiah's health was failing. Age and exhaustion weighed heavy on him. Ruth had become a ghost within her own house, barely leaving her room. Elizabeth managed the household, but lacked both the will and the power to command the fields. The war years descended upon them, years of chaos, decay, and reckoning, the Union blockade that strangled Southern. Rome ports made the sale of cotton nearly impossible. Confederate money lost its value with each passing month, crumbling into paper worth less than the ink that printed it. Food that once sustained the plantations was now seized to feed the Confederate army. The Jessup plantation began to decay from within. Roofs leaked, fences broke, tools rusted where they lay. Fields were planted and harvested, but with little supervision and growing defiance. Whispers of freedom drifted across the quarters, tales of Union victories, of enslaved people fleeing to the North, of Lincoln's proclamation in 1863 that promised emancipation. Hope, faint at first, began to take root where despair had long lived. The enslaved people sensed that the world was shifting, that the chains of their captivity were being broken by forces larger than any overseer or master. They waited in silence for deliverance. Thomas Jessup fell at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Daniel succumbed to dysentery in a Virginia camp the following year. Their deaths shattered Isaiah. The sons he had molded to continue his empire were gone. The legacy he had built on bondage and bloodline perished with them. Ruth followed in August 1864, slipping away quietly in her sleep. The doctor called it heart failure, but it was more truthfully the collapse of a soul crushed beneath years of guilt and grief. She was buried beside Margaret beneath the cypress trees. By early 1865, the Jessup plantation was a hollow echo of its former power. Isaiah, 70 and frail, sat mostly in silence, his mind clouded, his body failing. Elizabeth, 26, tried to hold the remnants together, but the structure was already crumbling. The enslaved people no longer labored with fear. They worked listlessly, eyes on the horizon, waiting for the Union army they knew would come. The overseers had fled, some to war, others northward. The barns sagged, the house cracked, the fields went untended. Then came April 1865. The Confederacy surrendered. The war, and with it slavery, was over. The empire, the Jessops, had built upon flesh and suffering dissolved overnight. Union troops arrived in Woodville the next month. An officer rode to the plantation to deliver the news. The people once enslaved here were free. Isaiah, ravaged by stroke and confined to his chair, could barely grasp the words. Elizabeth understood perfectly, but refused to believe. She argued, demanded compensation, insisted these men and women were her property by divine and lawful right. The officer's response was cold and final. Slavery was abolished, and the Constitution itself confirmed it. The freed people gathered their few belongings. Some walked away that very day, stepping beyond the gates that had once confined them. Others lingered for weeks, torn between fear and hope, unsure where to go or what freedom would mean. By midsummer, only a few frail souls remained. Hannah, the first woman forced into the breeding program, left with her surviving children, heading north until she reached Memphis, where she lived out her days as a washerwoman until 1889. Rachel journeyed west toward Vicksburg. Julia, broken in mind and spirit, stayed behind until freedmen persuaded her to follow them to a camp where aid awaited. The children born of the Jessup men, those who lived to see freedom, scattered like seeds on the wind. They took new names, leaving behind the curse of Jessup forever. Some became farmers, working their own plots of land with pride and toil. Others moved to growing towns and cities, seeking new lives beyond the reach of their past. A few managed to secure education, rising to become teachers, preachers, or ministers who carried both knowledge and memory. They bore the scars and silent burdens of their origins throughout their lives, yet they lived as free people. Isaiah Jessup died in October of 1865. The official cause was listed as complications following a stroke. But more profoundly, he died because the world he had known, controlled and built had crumbled, and he lacked the capacity to adapt to a new reality. He was buried in the family cemetery beside Ruth and Margaret, under an unmarked sky. No one mourned him except Elizabeth. Elizabeth tried in vain to maintain the plantation after her father's death, but it was a lost cause. She had no labor force, no capital, no credit to sustain the estate. The cotton gin had never been rebuilt after the fire. The buildings rotted further. The fields fell into disrepair. By 1867, she sold the property for a fraction of its former worth to a northern investor who planned to parcel it into smaller farms worked by free labor. Elizabeth took the proceeds and moved to Mobile, Alabama, living with distant relatives. She never married. She never spoke publicly about the plantation or her family's history, and she died quietly in 1891, aged 52. Samuel Jessup, the son who had fled in 1859, survived the war years under an assumed name, working odd jobs in Natchez and New Orleans. He never stopped drinking. In 1872, he died of liver failure, estranged from his remaining family, leaving no heirs, leaving few possessions. His passing went almost entirely unnoticed. By 1870, the Jessup plantation itself had been divided into 4 separate farms. The main house, stripped bare of furnishings and abandoned, crumbled slowly over decades. By the turn of the century, nothing remained but foundations, weathered stones, and a scattering of outbuildings. The slave quarters rotted away, lost to time. The family cemetery became overgrown, its location forgotten. The cotton gin site was plowed under, replaced with ordinary crops. The children born of the breeding program and their descendants dispersed across the South and eventually across the nation. Most never learned the full truth of their origin. The trauma was buried too deep to speak of, and the surviving mothers who had endured the program rarely told their children the details of their conception. That secret was passed down quietly, sealed with each generation. The Jessup ledgers, painstaking records of the breeding program, survived by accident. They were stored in a locked trunk, which eventually came into the hands of a descendant of Ruth's sister in South Carolina. In 1962, that descendant, cleaning out an attic, discovered the trunk and the ledgers within. Shocked by their contents, the descendant donated them to a university archive, where they became available to historians investigating slavery's realities. Those ledgers, along with scattered letters, county records, and oral history, histories gathered from descendants of the enslaved people who survived the Jessup Plantation form a disturbing record of what occurred between 1835 and 1865. The story is documented, verifiable, and profoundly unsettling. The Jessup case was not unique. Historical research has revealed numerous plantations across the South where owners forced enslaved women into sexual relationships, creating systematic breeding programs to increase enslaved populations. What makes the Jessup case particularly notable is the degree of documentation, the cold, clinical records Isaiah kept, treating human reproduction as though it were livestock husbandry. The psychological damage inflicted was incalculable. Enslaved women, repeatedly raped, forced to bear children they could not raise, living in constant terror and degradation, endured trauma that scarred them for life and passed down through generations. The Jessup children, born and raised within this system of abuse, carried wounds of their own, deeply etched and beyond repair. Thomas and Daniel died young in a war defending the system that had corroded their souls. Samuel drank himself into an early grave, desperately trying to flee the weight of his guilt. Margaret died, delivering her sixth child born from the breeding program. Elizabeth lived much longer, but never discovered peace or true happiness. Ruth and Isaiah, the architects and enforcers of the program, lived long enough to witness its collapse, yet never admitted or acknowledged the evil they had created. They passed away, believing they had been faithful Christians, dutiful and responsible plantation owners, victims of northern aggression, and casualties of economic forces beyond their control. They never accepted moral responsibility for the suffering and destruction they caused. The most chilling aspect of the Jessup case is how ordinary and unremarkable they appeared to those around them. Church members who had known them for decades described Isaiah as a devoted patriarch, and Ruth as a devout woman who read scripture daily and faithfully. Business partners and associates considered Isaiah honest in his dealings, prompt in paying debts, trustworthy in contracts, reliable in obligations. Neighbors regarded the Jessup family as pillars of their community. No one intervened because no one believed intervention was necessary. The horror remained hidden in plain sight, shielded by the legal framework of slavery and reinforced by social conventions that forbade questioning what happened on a man's property. The enslaved people who survived the Jessup Plantation carried their trauma silently for decades after emancipation. In the 1930s, when the Federal Writers Project conducted interviews with formerly enslaved people to document American history, several survivors from the Jessup Plantation were interviewed. Their testimonies, spoken in aged voices but vivid in recollection, confirmed the existence of the breeding program. An elderly woman named Patience, born on the plantation in 1854, told her interviewer plainly, "Mr. Jessup, he run that place like he was God himself. He decided who born, who live, who sold away. His own children, and did what he said, every one of them. We wasn't people to them, we was crops they was growing." These oral histories, preserved in the archives of the Library of Congress, corroborate the documentary evidence found within the ledgers. What happened on the Jessup Plantation between 1835 and 1865 was legal under the laws of Mississippi and the Confederate States. That is perhaps the most disturbing fact of all. Isaiah Jessup was never charged with any crime, never investigated by authorities, and never held accountable in any legal sense. The system of slavery granted him absolute power over those he owned, and he wielded that power to build a nightmare that lasted for 3 decades. His family participated willingly, shaped by their upbringing into believing their actions were not only permissible but admirable, a demonstration of business acumen and family loyalty. The Jessup breeding program was slavery functioning exactly as it was designed to operate, reducing human beings to property, stripping them of their agency, exploiting them for profit, and destroying them without consequence. The children born from the breeding program numbered at least 47 according to Isaiah's meticulous ledgers, though the true number may have been higher, as some births likely went unrecorded, particularly those that resulted in infant deaths. Of those 47 documented children, approximately 30 survived to see emancipation. Their descendants today number in the hundreds, scattered across the United States, most unaware of their connection to the Jessup Plantation or the circumstances of their ancestors' births. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed genetic links between individuals descended from the enslaved population and those descended from the Jessup family, providing scientific verification of what the historical records had already documented. Some descend. Ants have sought each other out, forming connections across racial lines born of shared trauma. Others choose not to know, finding the truth too painful to confront.